Attempted murder rose by almost 25%. Assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm is increased by 18%, and there were 19.7% more hijackings. The good news is that house robberies dropped slightly, and robberies at business premises dropped by 3.5%. Right, let's get some reaction to the latest crime stats. Let's speak to criminologist Guy Lamb to give us more information. Guy, thank you very much for speaking to us here on All Angles. It's good to have you with us. But you know, you're a criminologist, so you try and look at the behaviors of criminals to understand, for instance, their background, etc., and why they commit crimes. I'm interested to know, in terms of the leading, the bad police stations, or the police stations that get, you know, all the bad crimes reported. The provinces are KZN, the Eastern Cape, the Western Cape and Gauteng. Why is it always these provinces? What kind of people do we have in these four provinces?
Well, I mean, it's a bit more complicated than the people. It's got to do largely with these are predominantly urban provinces in the sense, especially when you look at Gauteng, Western Cape to a degree. That's largely where the populations are concentrated. And globally, we see in big cities with complex problems and inequalities, you tend to have very high crime rates. But of course, within South Africa, there's different things that are driving the violence. Certainly within the Western Cape, it's consistently been gang violence and gang conflicts. So if we're looking at the stations that are featuring there, we've got, you know, Delft and Kraaifontein, which are featuring. But also what we're seeing reflected in these stats are what's happening with the mass killings that we've been seeing in Khayelitsha and places like Umfuleni. That's featuring very prominently there. And so it's often around disagreements, arguments, organized crime, and having this combination of access to firearms. In the case of KwaZulu-Natal, it's become a lot more unstable in recent years. And, you know, this is playing out not only in the sense of political violence, but also in the sense of kind of just conflicts between people, arguments that are escalating and resulting in violence. So the Eastern Cape is more interesting. I know we certainly know in Gqeberha, in the sort of surrounding areas, gang violence has been playing quite a prominent role. Also, access to firearms is a key problem, especially illegal firearms. So it's not necessarily the people. It's got to do with urbanization. It's got to do with living conditions. It's got to do with groups that engage in violence, and it's got to do with access to weapons.
Looking at the kidnappings, and I don't know if you're privy to hearing that snippet of the minister's address talking about the fact that Gauteng had most kidnappings. This is obviously a new category that they share with the public now. It's the second time that they're doing it. But now, am I correct in assuming that the reason that kidnappings mostly happen in Gauteng is because a lot of people live here for business reasons, for working reasons, etc., and therefore this is where all the criminals think money exchanges hands?
It's yes, and in many respects, but I think just what's been quite helpful, what the police have been doing is releasing this disaggregated data about kidnapping and really sort of indicating what are the kidnapping circumstances, because the conversations we're having at the moment tend to be in the sort of media focus has been around abductions. And it's been around ransoms, where what the police data is showing that most kidnappings are related to car hijackings or they're related to robbery. So individuals who are in cars are carjacked and individuals taken to a ATM to withdraw cash and they have their valuables stolen, or they're abducted off the street, taken to an ATM and had their cash withdrawn from the ATM. Very interesting things happening in Gauteng, which is mentioned. I mean, showing, for example, a 300% increase in kidnappings in Gauteng, and specifically in certain areas. I mean, you're looking at places like Delmas, you're looking at places like Kempton Park, where you're seeing massive jumps in kidnappings happening there. So that suggests that there maybe are organized criminal groups that are operating there, that are preying on motorists, that are preying on members of the public. So Gauteng is a problem, but not only Gauteng, we're seeing Mpumalanga as well, major increases in KwaZulu-Natal. So, but these are happening in very specific places, so certainly do speak to the role of organized kind of carjacking groups and organized criminal groups.
I mean, Mr. Lamb, these statistics actually take us back to how bad it is in South Africa. As a woman myself, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, the fact that I survive every day, I should be very grateful, right? 10,818 rapes in 3 months, and murders going up by more than 1,000 compared to the same period last year. Previously, there used to be this debate, Mr. Lamb, about whether or not crime went up because of the hard lockdown, etc. What do you attribute these first 3 months of this year to? Why are we seeing the statistics shoot up so high?
I mean, it's deeply concerning. I mean, we're seeing as major increases and double-digit increases in most categories of violent crime. I mean, you're referencing violence against women. I mean, what the presentation that the minister presented, I mean, it showed a 37% increase in murder of children and a 17.5% increase of women. I mean, this is quite substantial, because if you look at sort of murders, it's typically young men killing young men, but we're seeing a much more dramatic increase here. And so your question about lockdown, and lockdown did have a depressive effect on crime, and certainly because people were confined to homes. So we saw reductions in murders and armed robberies taking place and attempted murders taking place. But I think what we're seeing now is the pressures that COVID's done to the economy in terms of unemployment, increases in poverty and teachers, increases in tension and stress, and it's playing out in households. And we're seeing, this sort of increases in violence against women and increases in violence against children as an indicator of that, is that households and neighborhoods that have been prone to crime and violence before are already just feeling far more pressure now, and as a result we're seeing a lot more violence, especially murders and attempted murders and assaults.
I just want to go back to, the fact that when you talk about serious crimes, it's always, for rape. I remember at some point there were townships that were called murder capitals, like Langa and Nyanga. At some point, there were also some Eastern Cape townships. So this obviously means the demographics also count, and it obviously means that the criminals are still within the townships and they're not necessarily moving into the richer areas or suburbs.
I mean, it depends on the type of crime, and always the challenge with crime statistics when they're released is how reliable are certain categories. So murder is pretty reliable, but when you're getting into other forms of crime, it's sometimes a bit difficult to tell. But certainly, we're still seeing patterns remaining as they were before, concentrated in certain high crime areas in the four key provinces: Gauteng, Western Cape, Eastern Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal, and we're seeing it in the same areas. I think that the big concern is what's happening in KwaZulu-Natal and places like Umlazi, places like Plesisleya, Inanda, major increases in crime and violence happening in these places. And then we really need to be asking questions, what can we do about those places? Because what the sort of South African government is saying is they want to reduce violent crime by 50% by, I think it's like 2030. And if you want to do that, you have to the high crime places, high violence places, and have very targeted interventions that are going to bring down those crimes.
I think what's also scary for me, Mr. Lamb, is when you as a criminologist look at the behavior, for instance, of a rapist, and you find out that I don't know if it's a world problem, but we know that in South Africa the issue is most of the time these rapes are at the hands of people that you know and trust. So a husband raping his wife, or a father raping his child, or an uncle or a neighbor. What does it say in terms of a rapist's behavior? That means you're just looking at me, as your daughter or your wife, and you think I'm meat.
I mean, we have a massive problem of sort of men's violence against women, men's violence against girls. I mean, it has to do with a variety of factors, but one of the key problems has to do with norms, and it's a sort of sense of how women sort of view women as possessions, view women as lesser than, seeing it as acceptable to use different forms of violence, and specifically sexual violence against women and girls. And it's a massive problem within South Africa, and it's sort of a number of interventions are in place. We have a specific plan to deal with this, but it's only been in existence for a year or two now, and of course been undermined by COVID and lockdowns. So we've still got a very long way to go in the context of this. As I say, norms are a key issue, but of course poverty plays into this, unemployment plays into all of this, but ultimately it does come down to men's views of women.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to us here on All Angles. Guy Lamb, a criminologist, reacting to the crime statistics that we've just received from that for you. 6,083 people were killed in South Africa in just the first 3 months of the year. That's over 1,000 more compared to the same period last year. And 10,818 people were raped in the first 3 months of this year. And Guy Lamb breaking it down, saying 37%, an increase of 37% when it comes to the children that have been killed.